during the Cultural Revolution had come alive again. Restored, too, were the teachers, many of whom had been brutally persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. A Young People's Liberation Army, PLA officer, an aspiring artist named Hu Ming, arrived back in Beijing on furlough in the spring of 1979 and was intoxicated by what she found. During her service with the PLA, she had had her share of challenges and excitement. She had ridden the meadows of the far western Turk-speaking province of Xinjiang on horseback and had gone into the earthquake-ravaged city of Tangshan as a documentary filmmaker in 1976. Yet, even 30 years later, when asked to write about life in the capital in 1979, she couldn't contain her excitement. "Beijing in 1979 is an eternal spring in our memory," she wrote. "Dancing in the spring rain were many young hearts. They were manic, free, and pure." She listed all that was new, strange, and exciting that spring: portable tape recorders, foreign film weeks, the music of Jean-Michel Jarre, leather jackets, Frédéric Chopin, dancing with boys, and queuing all night for tickets to Swan Lake. Most exciting was that the capital seemed to be full of young people like herself who dreamed of creating art. Everywhere, at cross streets and at the railway station, at the long-distance bus station, you would find groups of people riding bicycles or walking with painting gear strapped to their backs. She was finding a whole world of kindred spirits who had been invisible before. She soon entered the orbit of today, as her best friend Xiao Fei had met Beidao and fallen in love. Meanwhile, Hu Ming realized her own dream by securing a place at the art school in the nearby port city of Tianjin. But as she remarked wryly later, it was those artists who didn't get into art school, people like Huang Rui, who would prove to be the masters of her generation. Huang Rui had sat at the entrance exam for the prestigious Central Academy of Fine Arts, but missed out. So he continued his art education as he started it, ferreting out art books in libraries and tracking down retired painters to be his mentors. Finally, he discovered an art course for workers at the Beijing Working People's Cultural Palace, east of Tiananmen Square. There he encountered another talent as passionate and iconoclastic as himself, a young man called Ma Deshang, who had contributed 2 woodblock prints to the first issue of Today. Ma's work was a million miles from the stock state-approved imagery of smiling workers and peasants. It had more in common with the stark version of German expressionists like Kata Kollwitz, a ferociously energetic figure who had spent a lifetime on crutches after suffering childhood polio. Ma Deshang was the ideal collaborator for Huang Rui. Both men had a vision for a new kind of Chinese art. Both kept works hidden away at home that needed to find an audience. Both were in search of others like themselves, who worked humdrum day jobs, but created art at night because it was the only thing they wanted to do. It was just a matter of finding them. As winter turned to early spring, barriers to artistic expression seemed to be melting away. But it was a different story for political dissent. In late March 1979 came a well-sourced rumor that, in a secret speech to the party leadership, Deng Xiaoping had called for a crackdown on Democracy Wall. In just a few short months, the wall had grown into something that, to the government, looked worryingly like an organized movement. Publishers of unofficial journals appeared to believe it was their right to be part of the reform process and were encouraging people to discuss political issues and problems themselves. In pursuit of economic reform, Deng was happy to harness the energies of intellectuals, scientists, officials, and even entrepreneurs, all of whom had been sidelined and humiliated during the Cultural Revolution. But political decisions, and even political dialogue itself, were to remain a matter for party control. Faced with the near certainty of a government crackdown, the Democracy Wall community split on the question of tactics. Wei Jingsheng wanted to denounce the government's plans in writing. Liu Qing, co-editor of April 5th Forum, counseled caution. Wei Jingsheng decided to go it alone. On March 25th, he returned to Democracy Wall to post what would be his final essay. Its title, An Urgent Question. Do we want democracy or a new autocracy? In it, he warned of the danger that Deng could become another dictator. History tells us, he wrote, that there must be a limit to the trust placed in any one person. 3 days later, new regulations appeared, banning any expression of opinion that did not adhere to the 4 cardinal principles: socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the leadership of the Communist Party, and Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. The next day, Wei was arrested. It was a terrible blow which stopped most activists in their tracks. But even as a hammer came down on political dissent, China's painters, writers, and poets persisted in probing the artistic limits, and the response of the leadership was more tentative. Into this vacuum, Huang Rui and his friends were only too happy to venture. On a warm evening in May 1979, dozens of young people arrived at a dilapidated office building in eastern Beijing. The space was only 1.5 little rooms on the corner of a dusty courtyard behind a deserted Buddhist temple, but it was a symbol of the success of today. It was just 5 months since Huang Rui had ridden out across the snowy city to post the first issue of the magazine. Things had moved fast since then. Today was now being read all over the country. They were publishing 1,000 copies an issue, but that was only a fraction of their audience. Every day brought letters from readers recounting how they were sharing their single copy around a dormitory, an office, or a group of friends. Copies were being posted on notice boards and on other democracy walls, and being read aloud in parks and in homes. Every week brought contributions by young poets, writers, and artists from around the country. The magazine's office had originally been home to Liu Qing's mother, who had vacated it so that her newly married younger son would have somewhere to live with his bride. But the son insisted that the Today crowd, whom he idolized, should take the space instead. He moved into his university dormitory, while his wife stoically scoured the city for new digs. Manker slept in the half-room, his plank bed converting into a sofa for meetings during the day and into a desk for the mimeograph at printing time. The office quickly became a place of pilgrimage for young poets, artists, and dreamers. Tonight the place was crowded for a strategy meeting for an unprecedented event in the history of the People's Republic. They were planning an exhibition of work by the outsiders of Beijing's art world, a little band to whom Huang Rui and Ma Desheng had reached out, who reveled in the official no-go areas of art, the personal, not the political, the realistic, not the rosy, the experimental, not the traditional. The team that came together in the smoking room may have been untutored, but it was bursting with talent. There was Ma Desheng, who made angry, virile, technically masterful woodcuts; Qu Lei, whose fine ink portraits were rich with personal imagery; Yan Li, a new friend of Huang Rui's, who painted brightly colored takes on Cubism; and Wang Keping, whose powerful, politically pointed sculptures in scavenged hunks of wood were the very antithesis of safe official orthodoxy. As the meeting got down to business, their first decision was the name of their group. They would call themselves the Stars. The Stars, for a group of art school rejects. Actually, this wasn't a boast. It was a sly political joke with a touch of the poetic. They had all grown up being told that the only heavenly body that mattered was the sun, and the sun was Mao Zedong, whose solar radiance was celebrated in poems, songs, and paintings. Now, the great helmsman was gone. "Only when the sun has set," said Huang Rui, "can you see the stars." Their second question was where to exhibit. In Beijing in 1979, there were no private buildings. Even the Today office was unauthorized and technically illegal. You could hold a poetry reading in a park, and you could post a magazine on a wall, but an art exhibition needed a space of its own. To use a space, you needed a permit, and to get a permit, you had to be a member of the Artists' Association. But the Stars weren't members. That was the whole point of being the Stars. They eventually found a solution, and they would go on to mount their exhibition. But the whipsaw reaction of the authorities would expose divisions in the Chinese leadership over reform strategy. To some, taking the shackles off artistic expression was dangerous. It was all very well to liberalize the economy, but democracy wall had shown where free thought could lead. Should art be reined in as well? The turbulent way in which that question played out, and is still playing out today, assured the Stars a permanent place in history. The meeting determined they should seek out the chairman of the Beijing Artists' Association, Liu Xing, and ask for his advice. He might not be able to help them, but he would understand the delicacy of their position. Liu had spent a decade in jail after being trapped by Mao's infamous 100 Flowers movement in 1956. Mao had called for intellectuals and artists to engage in open discussion of the country's problems. Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. Mao believed that the discussion would find a natural center of gravity. After all, socialism was the only logical solution to human problems and contradictions, and finding new pathways to that conclusion would be a healthy thing. In the event, debates headed in directions that shocked the leadership with open discussions of the merits of democracy. Mao shut down the movement, but not before taking careful note of who had written what. Liu Xing was singled out in the anti-rightist campaign in 1957 and imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution. He was only rehabilitated after the return of Deng Xiaoping to the capital in 1977. So in the early summer of 1979, the stars met with Liu Xing and showed him their work. As an oil painter with a taste for the iconoclastic, he was excited by what he saw and immediately offered to help. But almost straight away it became clear that, despite Liu's goodwill, it would not be simple. Each of the 23 artists in the exhibition would need to declare their details, their occupations, and their political status in advance. And it would not be until the next year that they would be able to secure an official exhibition space, if at all. The stars felt they couldn't afford to wait. There were already too many omens that this exhilarating moment of liberty in their lives might be short-lived. Wei Jingsheng had been in custody for 2 months, and there was no word of his fate. Criticisms of the party had been outlawed, and Democracy Wall was now a gloomier, less edgy place. True, today continued to thrive, and every day new books, new music, and new people were turning up in Beijing. But, despite this, they could feel a chill in the air. So they decided, secretly, that they should move now and forget about a space. They would exhibit in the open air. The show would be in autumn, the capital's most beautiful season, and would coincide with China's National Day on October 1st, when the nation would be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the People's Republic. Then came the question of where to exhibit. Democracy Wall was too chaotic. The old Summer Palace, a melancholy ruin northwest of the city, had an atmosphere but was too remote. The forecourt of the China Radio Building at the far western end of Chang'an Avenue was perfect, except that it was a bastion of the propaganda ministry and would not tolerate them for a moment. And then they realized that the solution had been hiding in plain sight. They could show at the National Art Museum in the center of the capital. Come late September, the museum would have an official exhibition of Chinese art in honor of National Day. This would be the establishment's choice of the works that best represented that moment in history. The stars would display their counterpoint to this on the railings of a large garden just to the east of the building. They would open on September 27th and run for 1 week. As the day drew close, they began to spread the word among their friends, and then on September 26th, they rode out to the universities, through the city and to Democracy Wall, posting a notice calling on people to come and see the stars. September 27th was a perfect Beijing autumn day, which meant the weather was as beautiful as you could find anywhere in the world. The 23 artists gathered early, bringing their works on pedal carts and on the backs of bicycles, and then tying them to the garden railings with twine. Altogether, 150 works were hung that day. Huang Rui's secret painting of the year before was on display for the first time, dappled by sunlight shining through the trees. Beijing was a small place then. Most people lived within what is now called the Second Ring Road, which follows the course of the old city walls that were torn down in the 1950s. Within that perimeter, news spread fast. Office workers arrived with their shopping and their children in their arms. Students rushed there after school. People worked their way quietly, intently along the railings, examining each work in turn and stopping to read the Stars Manifesto. We, 23 art explorers, placed some fruits of our labor here. The shadows of the past and the light of the future overlap to form our multi-layered lives today. We live on with determination and remember every lesson we have been taught. This is our responsibility. A group of students gathered, laughing with shock at Wang Keping's sculptures. One piece, carved from the rung of a broken chair, showed a shrunken, distorted figure, its outsized arm and hand thrust towards the sky, brandishing a little book. Titled, "Long Live the Emperor," the work's target was unmistakable, as was the artist's contempt for the era it depicted. More visceral still was the work he called Silence. A carved face stared out, one eye blacked out, and a large wooden stopper in its mouth. Nearby hung a Madershang woodcut of a farmer and his oxen plowing a darkened field. The figures were tiny and exposed in a shaft of light under the gaze of a gigantic figure. It was titled Rest, and the irony was obvious. There would be no rest for the farmer this side of the grave. In interviews, Ma Desheng later made no secret of his anger at the party's hypocrisy over China's peasants. He had seen enough of rural life during the Cultural Revolution to know its grinding poverty, and to see it through the cant of urban cadres who glorified the peasantry, but whose own lives were paradise by comparison. The political edge to Huang Rui's work was gentler. Apart from his commemoration of the April 1976 Qingming demonstration, he had hung 2 paintings of the ruins of the old summer palace. Known as the Garden of Perfect Brightness, Yuanmingyuan, the palace complex stretching for 857 acres beneath Beijing's fragrant hills had been the favorite home of the Qing imperial family for 150 years. It was a place of legendary beauty, its Chinese-style pavilions and gardens interspersed with Italianate follies designed by the emperor's Jesuit advisors, complete with whimsical musical clocks and curly-cued marble archways. In 1860, French and English troops razed the entire complex at the height of the Second Opium War. The palaces were never rebuilt, and in 1979, the lonely ruins were an ambiguous witness to whatever version of history it seemed correct to subscribe to. Huang Rui painted the ruins repeatedly in 1979, each time investing the stones with something new. In the First Stars exhibition, he hung 2 paintings of the same stand of ruined columns, stark against the sky. In the first, which he called Last Will and Testament, the sky was a smoldering coal black, the sun blood red. In a second painting, the columns stood against a blue sky filled with clouds amid green pastures, and the shape of the columns had shifted slightly so they seemed like couples embracing in the sun. This painting he called New Life. Today, the Communist Party has preserved the ruin of the old summer palace as a reminder of the humiliation heaped on pre-revolutionary China by foreign powers. But in 1979, Huang Rui claimed it for his generation. The ruins seemed to show that you could survive utter destruction and, in the aftermath, find new hope. For a generation that had come through the Cultural Revolution, this meaning was clear. In a tree by the railings of the museum, Huang Rui had hung an old exercise book on a string with a pencil attached to a visitor's book in which the artists encouraged people to write their impressions of the works. That day, a person who called himself an elder wrote that in the paintings he found fresh and robust strength emerging from ruins amid rotten grass, young blood, bright colors, vibrant brushwork. "Ah," he exclaimed, "your art enlivens this old man's heart." When Liu Xing arrived, he was unperturbed by the stars' impatience and their cheek at exhibiting without permission. Surrounded by a crowd, he toured the exhibition smiling at what he saw. On the same day, the show was visited by Jiang Fen, chairman of the China Arts Association and dean of the Central Academy of Fine Arts. He was a veteran of the political struggles of the 1930s and 40s and had been repeatedly imprisoned for his fealty to the Communist Party. After the founding of the People's Republic, he had pioneered the teaching of oil painting and the expansion of art education beyond the universities into high schools. But after the 100 Flowers campaign, he was labeled a rightist, stripped of his posts, and sent into exile. Like Liu Xing, he had only just returned to Beijing. When he stood among the young artists and their works that day, he only had 3 more years to live, and he acted like he knew it. He was excited and had no intention of discouraging the stars. "Art exhibitions in the open air are a fine thing," he declared. "One can exhibit inside an art gallery, and one can also exhibit outside the gallery. Artists rise from within the Art Academy, as well as from outside it." He then briskly instructed the museum curators to accommodate the stars' works within the official grounds, where they would be safer. That night the stars partied on Beijing beer and ergotal, and pooled their funds to buy bowls of cabbage noodles. Their friends from today toasted their success. The second day of the exhibition went as well as the first. Hundreds of people were stopping by to see the stars' works, and the others arriving for the official exhibition at the museum also came over to loiter in the sun and pore over the works. It was like a dream. Then they woke up. On the morning of September 29th, Huang Rui arrived at the exhibition to find all the billboards for their show torn down. In the park was a group of provocateurs who had taunted the artists and the others who had gathered to see the show. Earlier that morning, the local Public Security Bureau, China's police force, had sent 100 officers to the National Art Museum to seize the works and post a notice that the exhibition had been banned. The edict was backdated to the opening day, September 27th, to make the show look doubly illegal. Liu Xing was appalled. He invited the stars to meet with him at the Huafangjai, a beautiful pavilion in Beihai Park to the northwest of the Forbidden City. Beihai had once been part of the imperial pleasure gardens built around the capital's northern lake, but had been opened to the public after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The pavilion where the stars went to meet Liu Xing was beautifully decorated and built around a lily pond. Wang Keping remembered later that the lilies were beginning to shrivel as autumn was drawing in, but the water was still sparkling. It was here that the Beijing Artists Association had their official exhibition space, in 4 separate halls built around the courtyard. Liu Xing took the artists through the calendar for Huafangjai and offered them a date later in the year. They accepted and tried to see it as a victory. After all, a few weeks earlier there had been no place for them in the official schedule, and now they had a chance to hang their work in one of the loveliest spaces in the capital. It was a big step up from the park railings in the open air. Yet, as they left, they couldn't help feeling it was the wrong call. They met that night with their friends from Today and the editors of the other unofficial journals like April 5th Forum, run by their friend Liu Qing. The editors had been excited by the Star's success, especially because the arrest of Wei Jingcheng and the muzzling of Democracy Wall had cast a pall over the reform movement. Somehow the compromise of the Huafangjai show didn't seem enough. After all, Liu Qing argued, the Stars had done nothing illegal in the first place. Didn't the Constitution protect freedom of speech, publication, association, assembly, and demonstration? In the Stars case, Liu Qing saw a chance to make a stand. He and his co-editor, Xu Wenli, suggested they hold a demonstration on National Day, October 1st. Huang Rui argued against it. He wasn't scared, he said later. It was just that he hated politics and preferred the Quicksilver path they had taken to date. In his view, artists should use art to win. But the others disagreed. Wang Keping felt they had a responsibility to speak up for others. They had to make a stand for artistic freedom with their exhibition, and they could not just roll over now. Ma Deshang also argued strongly for a public protest. Outnumbered, Huang Rui agreed. And so they began to plan the first demonstration for freedom of speech ever held in the People's Republic of China. Once committed, Huang Rui realized that as one of the founders of the Stars, he must take a leading role. They drafted a declaration condemning the Public Security Bureau's actions and requesting that the Beijing government correct them. The next morning, they posted their declaration on Democracy Wall and sent a copy to the Beijing Communist Party Committee. Another copy was sent to the highest legal authority in Beijing, giving notice that the Stars intended suing the Public Security Bureau for infringing their rights. That afternoon, their patron Liu Xing came to beg them not to go ahead. After his long years in jail, he knew only too well where this could all lead. But the Stars were too fired up to back off. Together they decided on the slogans for their march. Liu Qing, the co-editor of April 5th Forum, proposed, "Fight for political democracy. Fight for artistic freedom." Wang Keping wisely counseled against parading the word fight through the streets, and they agreed that Liu Qing's banner should say, "We want political democracy. We want artistic freedom." The next morning, October 1st, they gathered in the rain at Democracy Wall. Huang Rui read the text of their complaint, and then Ma Deshang, wearing his trademark worker's cap, issued a vociferous call for action. Before the march, he had emptied his pockets of everything he owned and said goodbye to his parents, not knowing when he might see them again. Before they commenced, Huang Rui made one final gesture to art over politics. He had created a Stars logo, a stylized red rocket shooting through a blue sky and piercing the moon. He fashioned it into fabric badges and fixed one on the jacket of each of the Stars, a statement of their allegiance to a new ideal. With the big crowd falling in behind them, they set off, Huang Rui and Wang Keping in the lead, with Ma Deshang swinging along beside them on his crutches, his hair matted by rain and exertion. With them marched Bei Dao and Meng Ke, and their friends Liu Qing and Xu Wenli, along with the editors of all the main unofficial magazines. The whole nascent push for freedom of expression in China was on the move. They had planned to head up Chang'an Avenue to the Beijing government headquarters, but a police cordon blocked their way, so they took a winding route to their destination, singing the national anthem of the People's Republic and the International. By the time they reached the government headquarters an hour later, Their ranks had swelled to 1,000. Once there, Ma Zhesheng addressed the crowd again, speaking of the need for democracy. Xu Wenli, the co-editor of April 5th Forum, also called for democracy and denounced the abuses of power he had seen. All the speakers pointed out that the new Constitution of 1978 guaranteed their rights of freedom of speech, assembly, and association. These were the rights that would be pointed to over and over in the years to come. Among those inspired by the Star's action that day was a young Liu Xiaobo, a student at the time. In an article published 30 years later, he would draw a direct line from the events of that day in 1978 to the resurgent movement for human rights in China in the Olympics year of 2008. He too pointed to the words in the Chinese Constitution that were in such conflict with the actions of the leadership. By the end of 2008, he was under arrest, and 12 months later, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison for inciting subversion of state power. In 2010, he became the only Chinese citizen to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. At the end of their demonstration, the Stars and their friends flung hundreds of copies of their statement into the sky to drift into the hands of the crowd. That night, they celebrated the news from Liuxing that their exhibition would be allowed to reopen at the Huafangzai on November 23rd. It was the third time that the little group around Huang Rui had made history, first with the publication of Today, then the Stars exhibition, and finally the National Day demonstration for freedom of expression. In those early days of Deng Xiaoping's China, it seemed that making history was something that the young and brave could get used to doing. But then, just 2 weeks later, Wei Jingsheng was brought to trial. When Wei Jingsheng's trial began at the Beijing Intermediate Court on October 16th, he was charged with selling state secrets to foreigners and engaging in counter-revolutionary agitation. It was a double charge of treason. In such a situation, there was never any doubt about the verdict. Wei's requests for witnesses to speak on his behalf were ignored, and his lawyer was never given a copy of the indictment or told when the trial would take place. So Wei defended himself. There is a photograph of Wei in court, his head shaved as if he had already been found guilty, his face bent to his notes. It captured his situation well, the hopelessness of his position, and the indomitable, studious determination he brought to handling it. The evidence of selling state secrets came down to the transcript of Wei's interview with Reuters in early 1979, in which he talked freely about the Sino-Vietnamese War. Wei argued that nothing he said came from any special source other than the common rumor in Beijing, and the details he provided, such as the name of the commander of the Chinese forces, could hardly have caused any strategic harm. In summing up, he said, "First, I had no intention of betraying the motherland. Second, I supplied the enemy with nothing at all. Third, I gave my friends no official secrets, either national or military. Thus, the prosecution's accusation that I committed treason is unfounded." His defense took no account, of course, of what a sensitive subject the botched Chinese campaign against Vietnam was, particularly as it had been Deng Xiaoping's pet project. On the charge of counter-revolution, Wei took a bolder line, arguing that as full democracy must be the ultimate aim of revolution, it was those who imprisoned him who were the counter-revolutionaries, not he. It was his duty as a citizen to critique and discuss the system. If one insists on hearing pleasant criticism only and demand its absolute accuracy on pain of punishment, this is as good as forbidding criticism and banning reforms altogether. Which, of course, was the point. Deng, like Mao, was only interested in criticism as a means to an end that he already had in mind. It was fine to let 100 flowers bloom occasionally to fight off opposition in the party or advance your own agenda. But in the end, neither Mao nor Deng was interested in a running commentary from the masses. Leadership was for leaders. Although Wei's trial seemed a preordained exercise of power by a monolithic state, the reality was more complicated. Like so many of the events of that period, the Wei Jingsheng episode exposed leadership tensions over freedom of expression that would resonate for years to come. We now know that Hu Yaoban, a protege of Deng and his later choice for General Secretary of the Communist Party, argued against punishing Wei Jingsheng. The lead editor of People's Today at the time and a longtime collaborator of Hu Yaoban wrote later that Hu had argued for Wei's rights following his arrest, stating, I support anyone exercising their democratic rights under a socialist system. I hope everyone can enjoy the greatest freedom under the protection of the Constitution." In this he echoed what would be Wei's own argument, but then Hu went further to presciently warn his colleagues, "I respectfully suggest that comrades do not arrest people who engage in struggle, still less those who merely show concern. Those who are brave enough to raise these problems, I fear, will not be put off by being thrown in jail." 8 years later, in 1987, Hu Yaobang would himself fall victim to China's long struggle over internal dissent. He was forced to resign as general secretary and issued a humiliating self-criticism after he counseled compromise with a student protest movement that sprung up the previous year. It was Hu's death 2 years later that would spark the greatest challenge the Communist Party would ever face, the Tiananmen protest movement of 1989. When those 1989 demonstrations broke out, Wei Jingsheng would not be there. At the end of his one-day trial on October 16, 1979, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. 3 decades later, I sat at a dinner table in Beijing while a middle-aged Chinese artist tried to explain to a young American that China too had its Vietnam War. Puzzlement turned to irritation as the younger man assumed that there was some mistake in the translation. Finally, the artist jumped to his feet and rolled up his trousers to reveal left leg that was furrowed like a twisted tree. It was a bullet wound he had sustained as he crossed the border into Vietnam in the first days of the war. There was a moment of embarrassment among the Chinese at the table. The young American had learned a new fact of history, but the Chinese were reminded that this was something they were never supposed to know. The war that had sent Wei Jingsheng to jail 30 years before was now deeper than a secret. It had been forgotten. All along the tracks out of town they were holding up flaming torches in farewell. It was a pitch-black night in late 1979, and Guojiang was heading for Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province. It lay a few hundred kilometers from his hometown of Duyun in Guizhou, one of the poorest provinces in China. Kunming was a major city with good transport links to the Vietnam border, and it was the mustering point for new army recruits like Guojiang. Around him were the other boys who had enlisted. For all of them, joining the army had seemed like an adventure and a way out of poverty. But now, as they looked at the faces of their families in the torchlight, some of the boys were crying. Perhaps they were spooked by the leatherette seats in the carriage. Soldiers traveled in good trains, everyone knew that. Did first-class travel mean they were going to die? The army needed them to keep the border with Vietnam safe. The opening phase of the war with Vietnam had ended when the Chinese army had crossed back into China in March that year. But having poked the hornet's nest, the army found themselves caught in a sniping, skirmishing border tussle and facing the constant possibility of retaliation for their ill-planned invasion. Guojiang kept smiling for much longer than his fellows, smoking a cigarette and reflecting on the luck that had finally got him into the army. Before the war broke out, he had tried to enlist, but they had rejected him. He passed the physical. That wasn't the problem. He would only find out later that it was his background that had been held against him. His grandfather had been a small landholder and had enjoyed the respect of the nationalists who ruled China before the revolution. But now the army needed soldiers, lots of them, and when the recruiters rolled into town that year, there was no way a keen young man like him would be passed over for a little thing like class background. He'd been driving trucks since he had left school, and he hated it. To say he had graduated would be an exaggeration, since he hadn't spent much time in class. Nevertheless, he had learned some important things at school. He had watched his history book thin out as purged former heroes disappeared. His faith in official pronouncements disappeared with them. He had also learned that he could draw. When his parents first saw him using the margins of his books as a sketchpad, they made him stop. But his teacher encouraged him. A bookish urbanite who had been sent to the countryside for being a rightist, his teacher knew talent when he saw it. He spoke to Guojiang's parents, and from then to the end of his school days, Guojiang was free to draw on whatever spare paper he could get, which was usually the white spaces in his textbooks. By the time he caught the train that day at the end of 1979, Guojiang knew the only thing that really mattered to him was art. That and his school sweetheart, who kept telling him how disappointed she was that he wouldn't make anything of himself. Joining the army, he hoped, would impress her. And as for art, he could draw anywhere, couldn't he? And he owned a sketchpad now. About 40 kilometers outside Duying, they stopped at a siding and were offloaded onto a goods train. In the crush, he lost sight of everyone he knew, and as he sat in the dark, he finally felt scared. He could feel something changing in the air as the train traveled south. After hours in the cramped, noisy darkness, the train reached the end of the line, and they transferred to trucks. All around him, he heard different dialects. Some were from his home province of Guizhou and the neighboring one of Guangxi. But that day was the first time he heard singing tones of Cantonese and the harsh northern dialects of Hebei. He found out that in the army, Mandarin would be the lingua franca. Like most of the recruits, Guozhang's grasp of the official national language was pretty sketchy. At the same time as Guozhang was heading for the border, the Stars exhibition was reopening in Beijing as promised, in Beihai Park. It was late November. The lilies had all sunk below the surface in the courtyard pool at Huafangzai, and the water was thickening with ice. The Stars had never received an answer to their complaint about the police who had shut them down back in September. But 3 days after Liu Xin finally confirmed that their exhibition would go ahead, the People's Daily, the official mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, announced the exhibition in their pages. The Stars were not going to receive a direct reply to their complaint, but there was no mistaking the message they were getting through to the People's Daily. In those months, it had become clear that words could be dangerous, but it seemed that there was still room to maneuver in this new China of Deng Xiaoping's. A new decade was about to begin, and the Stars thought maybe, just maybe, it could belong to them. On opening day, people queued out the door in the bitter cold. Men in fake fur army hats and women in thick headscarves clapped their hands together to keep warm, chatting to strangers in the queue. Work by all 23 artists was back on display, the number of pieces swollen slightly to 163. Liu Xing and Jiang Feng visited again, and this time a host of other older artists came too. These elders, many of whom had suffered terribly over the previous 2 decades, wanted to show their support for the coming generation. Present on the first day was Wu Guangzong, who had studied in Paris in the years after the Second World War and had pioneered the teaching of Western modernization on his return to China after the founding of the People's Republic. Now he was fighting for the right to promote this tradition again after his years in the wilderness. The Stars put out their visitors' book again, and it quickly filled with comments of excited visitors. "Your hearts are full of human dignity," wrote one, "and are the conscience of the nation. History will leave a magnificent page for you, because people will not forget you." Among the hundreds of other entries, "Thanks to the Stars exhibition, I have seen human dignity with my own eyes. You are indeed the stars of a new culture. You have used your brushes and engraving knives to create new pictures for the people. You are pioneers of a new culture." Over the course of the exhibition, they counted more than 30,000 visitors. 9,000 bought tickets on the final day of December 3rd. The Stars were thriving in a world of ambiguity, where the interpretation of their works was left to others, and no words of theirs lay ready to trap them. Hating politics as they did, this was somewhere Huang Rui was happy to be. But even as success was all around them, he had received a sickening reminder of how narrow the line was between success and disaster. Just a few days before, his friend Liu Qing, co-editor of April 5th Forum, had disappeared. Liu had stood beside them from the start. His family had lent today the space for their office. He had helped the Stars draft their complaint to the police and helped organize their demonstration. On the day of their march, he had walked beside them in the rain and spoken passionately on their behalf, and now he had disappeared into the system like Wei Jingsheng had done 8 months before. Liu's crime was simple. He had dared to publish a transcript of Wei's defense at his trial. A journalist had slipped April 5th Forum a clandestine tape made at the trial, and they had printed it up in special handbills, which they then posted on Democracy Wall and sold in nearby streets on November 11th. That day, police arrived quickly to rip the transcript from the wall and confiscate the handbills, detaining also the people who had been selling them. Liu Qing had gone to the local public security bureau that same evening to complain, and now no one knew where he was. Huang Rui thought about where he was, in this beautiful pavilion that had been built for an emperor, an imperial pleasure garden that was now a public park. Nearby was the library where he had first seen Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People in a battered book. Now Western art books and magazines had begun to flood in. He had seen the works of Cézanne and Van Gogh, and had stood as close to them as the visitors to the Stars exhibition were now standing to his own paintings. Things were opening up ahead for him, but it seemed that things were at the same time closing up behind him. The Democracy Wall movement was dying, while the Stars were rising. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense. Almost a year after they had pasted up the first pages of Today on the walls of Beijing, Huang Rui was beginning to understand that avoiding politics was almost as difficult as ever. Politics didn't dominate them like it had during the Cultural Revolution, but their fight to be authentic to their own experiences, to express what they actually felt, was also a political choice. They had been trucked to the middle of nowhere and told to make camp. They slept in a deserted rice silo, deserted because there were no farmers in this border region anymore. Guojian had grown up in a subtropical world, but the dense foliage and choking humidity here was something different. Even though they were still kilometers from the Vietnam border, it felt like another country already. After a few weeks, he was picking up Mandarin quickly, along with a host of other dialects. His commanding officer was from Nanjing, so understanding Mandarin was imperative. Even so, it was hard to know what was going on. The training regime seemed designed to frighten them rather than teach them anything. Or maybe he had started to suspect. That was the point. They were constantly warned of the threat of Vietnamese spies crossing the border. Time after time, they were roused from sleep for night maneuvers. Their rifles had no ammunition, so no one was sure what they were supposed to do if they ran into a spy. When they asked, they were told to use knives or martial arts. Since no one had trained them in hand-to-hand combat, this wasn't a comforting answer. And yet, the conflict was real. Soldiers were being killed not far from their camp. After dark, the young recruits, most of whom had lied about their age to get into the army, cried in their tents. Somehow, Guojian was singled out for better things. At the end of 3 months, he had been chosen for training as a signals officer. This meant promotion, of course, but better still. Signals officers got to work the camp's radio. He was told the radio was strictly for military use, but how, he reasoned to himself, was he going to learn how it worked if he didn't do a little channel surfing? Soon he was up half the night chasing frequencies, smoking local tobacco from a Yunnan pipe, too excited to sleep. The other duty was regimental secretary, storing the gear of men who were being sent to the front. Each of them would write a letter to their families before they went, and he filed them carefully away. Every week they were leaving, but it seemed like they never came back. One day a really gung-ho type, a guy he'd met on the first day he'd arrived in camp, turned up full of heroic tales of the fighting he'd seen, invalided back to base with just a small wound to his leg. It was a relief to have someone return, as Guojian had started to feel like no one ever would. Or if they did, their wounds would be too terrible to look at. A few days later, the military police came to get the wounded returnee. It turned out he had shot himself in the leg, desperate to escape the front. They started to issue all the soldiers with a form, which they were told to fill out with their name, their parents' name, and their home address, and then in the space provided, just a few words about how they were ready to die for their country and how proud they were. The army had decided it was better to get these ready from the start, rather than leave it up to the soldiers to write letters themselves. Guojian filed these away too. When he could, he would draw, mostly portraits of the other soldiers. By the time he left the army, he had drawn almost every soldier he knew. Later he would reflect that this period provided more valuable artistic training than any he was to pick up at university. His superiors began to notice his talent, and he was given a sideline duty of painting propaganda posters for the troops. A new Chinese year was dawning, 1980, year of the monkey, a year for the brave, the clever and the quick, a year that would suit Guojian well. He kept on listening to the radio when he could, to keep his skills up, as he put it, and he did have a feel for it. He could chase a frequency through the air, and once he found it, hold on to it. One day he heard a woman's voice coming over the radio, sweeter and lovelier than anything he'd ever heard. She was singing in Mandarin, a song he would later discover was called Small Town Story. Her voice was so clear yet soft that it made him long for home like he never had before. That night, he picked up the yellow novel he had been reading, a piece of soft pornography posing as a romantic tale. The book had been passed from hand to hand among the recruits. It was contraband, but all the more titillating for that. Guojian had been gripped by it, but now as he tried to read it again, it seemed empty. There was no romance or passion here, He had heard that instead in the voice, and once heard, it was unforgettable. The name of the singer was Deng Lijun, although most people around the world knew her as Teresa Tung. She was a Taiwanese performer whose exquisite voice and achingly romantic delivery made her a megastar in the Chinese diaspora in the 1970s and 80s. Her music was never played on the radio in China because her Taiwanese background made her politically radioactive. But when cassette players became an affordable item in markets around the country, bootleg Deng Lijun tapes would make her a household name there. Years later, Guo Jian's generation would coin a joke based on the similarity of Deng Lijun's family name to Deng Xiaoping's. Was it Deng Xiaoping who transformed China at the end of the 20th century? Not Deng Xiaoping, it was Deng Lijun. It was a joke with an edge of truth. 30 years after he first heard her voice, China's leading dissident and Nobel Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo would reflect on the way the singer had changed his generation. Deng Lijun's songs, he wrote, took a generation of Chinese youth by storm, reawakening the soft centers of our beings. They dismantled the cast-iron framework of our revolutionary wills and caused these to collapse, and they revived sexual desires that we had long repressed into the darkest recesses of our beings. No doubt it was for these reasons more than her Taiwanese background that the Chinese government would try to ban Deng Lijun's music repeatedly from the late 1970s till her tragic death in 1995. Out on the border with Vietnam in 1979, Guo Jian knew nothing of this. He only knew that he was desperate to hear her again, and from then on he spent night after night chasing her up and down the frequencies as her unforgettable voice faded in and out. It wasn't long before he realized that the strongest signal broadcasting Deng Lijun came from a country that he had barely heard of, Australia. In those years, Radio Australia's transmitters beamed its signal from a flat plain near the farming community of Shepparton, Victoria, all the way north to China, where it was heard loud and clear from Yunnan, where Guo Jian was based, to the far western provinces of Xinjiang and Tibet, north to Inner Mongolia and Beijing, and east to Shanghai and Guangzhou. Radio Australia's Chinese service loved Deng Lijun. She performed in Mandarin, Cantonese, and English, and her Mandarin delivery was regarded as the most perfect in the world, with a clarity that was unsurpassed. And so they played her every hour, and Guo Jian soon learned when to listen for her. It became his guiltiest pleasure, and when the officers weren't within earshot, he would share it with his comrades in arms, holding fast to the frequency, chasing it when needs be, smoking his Yunnan pipe, and watching the smoke drifting into the sky. As the extraordinary year of 1979 drew to a close, China was at the beginning of a decade that in many ways was more free than any before or since in the history of the People's Republic. The 1980s took China from the beginning of Deng Xiaoping's Great Reform and opening up to the tragedy of Tiananmen Square, along the way fueling the most extravagant dreams of what China could be. The story of China's transformation would not belong simply to the men within the red walls of Zhongnanhai. It would be told in the traditional rice basket provinces of Sichuan and Anhui, where impoverished farmers returned to tilling their own fields, growing new crops, and developing side industries, pioneering the reforms that would power China's development through the 1980s. Told to by workers moving to the city, taking a chance in places like the sleeping fishing village of Shenzhen, which had just been declared a special economic zone and would become one of the richest cities in China, and told in thousands of factories across the Yangtze and Pearl River deltas, which would light an economic blaze through South China that would stun the world, and told by young people setting courses in life that just a few years earlier would have seemed impossible. The beginning of the 1980s found me deep in a dried-out summer, a student of history at the Australian National University in Canberra. I was tuning into the radio too, but not to Deng Lijun. The sound of the year for me was The Clash. I had no thought of young men fighting in a war I'd never heard of, listening into a sound that would change their lives. For me, China was blank then, a place of unpronounceable names and incomprehensible history. The Iceland of the Vikings was more real to me. I had read all the sagas, dreamt of their ships. The decision of some of my friends to enroll in Asian studies I regarded as eccentric, and the choice of Chinese by others was simply mystifying. There was only a handful of the latter that I could identify on campus. One of them was the older, bookish, bespectacled, and, as it turned out later, ambitious future Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. I wasn't sure that I was uninterested in the world, but it was the war in Afghanistan that was obsessing us in the summer of 1979 to 1980. It was the war we tend to forget now, the Soviet invasion at Christmas 1979 to shore up a friendly government. Democracy Wall in Beijing lived and died without my knowing. By the time the Soviets entered Kabul, the wall had been closed down forever. In December 1979, the Chinese government finally brought it to an end, just over a year since it had first begun to be a focus for dissent. They announced a new wall would be established in a far-off park where people could post their thoughts anytime they wished, as long as they applied for a permit. Over the old wall, they built a floodlit advertising billboard. In 1981, having graduated from university, I boarded a plane for Europe for the first time. As it happened, my journey took me via Taiwan. I walked the streets of Taipei in confusion. It was a polluted and depressing place then, still under martial law, not at all the vibrant city it is today. Yet in those few days, I started to feel the stirrings of the fascination that would eventually fuel my 3-decade-long relationship with China. In the National Palace Museum, I stood in awe in front of the Song Dynasty, 960 through 1279, hanging scroll, Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, seeing in that ancient painting how much more of the world there might be out there to know. A few days later, on a beach in the far south of Taiwan, near the port of Kaohsiung, I came across some Chinese characters that someone had scrawled in the sand with a stick. I stood looking for a while, as if staring for long enough might unlock their meaning. Suddenly I realized it didn't matter. I was there myself, and so I carved my name on this foreign beach with the end of a piece of driftwood and looked out across the Taiwan Strait towards mainland China where, for all I knew, there was someone standing on the beach right now writing in the sand, like me. As I stood on that beach, the 1980s were underway. Huang Rui and many like him had already put behind him events more powerful than I would experience in my whole lifetime. And as the sun went down over an army camp near the border with Vietnam, a young man my age was tuning into Australia on the radio, blowing smoke rings into the sky and hearing the voice of Deng Lijing singing to him, as if from another world. Chapter 4. Very Heaven. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. William Wordsworth, The French Revolution as it appeared to enthusiasts at its commencement. On a sweltering summer day in 1984, in a provincial capital far from Beijing, a young man was running fast across the dusty ground of the compound where he lived. His face was beading with sweat under his cropped hair and behind his thick-rimmed glasses, but no one was chasing him, and no one was running away. He was running for pure joy. His name was Shen Qi. He was only 19, but in his semi-uniform of neat pants and a crisp white short-sleeved shirt, he seemed even younger. Looking at him, you would never guess that he had just pulled off his first act of studied defiance of his loving, hard-working parents. They were both engineers, anxious, earnest servants of the People's Republic, and he was their only son. They had hoped he would follow in their footsteps, but it was from that very aspiration that he was running. In his hand he held a letter that would release him. He was going to Beijing to study art. It's not that his parents didn't know how to dream. His father had grown up in the countryside and had studied hard for a chance to forge a new destiny through university. His mother had grown up in Shanghai, and in that city's faded glamour had glimpsed something of what the world might hold. Together his parents had been pioneers in the city of Hefei, the capital of the rural province of Anhui, where Shen Qi had been born. They had helped build the new government buildings, the sports stadium, and the main theater. They were proud of their work, but they also saw how dangerous it could be if your ambitions led you away from the strictly utilitarian. There was too much politics in China, they told young Shen Qi. Study hard at your mathematics. In a country where the most innocent cultural pursuits could get you in trouble, it was safest to be a technician. During the Cultural Revolution, even engineers like his parents had to endure endless political meetings that stretched far into the night, while at home, Shen Qi and his youngest sister hid lonely and frightened under the bed covers. His father had tried to sell his son the romance of engineering. When Shen Qi was a young boy in the late 1960s, he had been taken to see the newly completed Nanjing Bridge. This was an engineering triumph of the times, a road rail span stretching thousands of meters across the Yangtze River, making possible the long-held dream of a Beijing-Shanghai train link. Shang-Chi still remembers his father ushering him into an elevator, which would, he would breathlessly explain to his son, transport them to the summit of the bridge's tallest pylon. But at the top, passengers were prohibited from getting out, so Shang-Chi's engineering adventure was nothing more than a stint in a metal box that took him back to where he had started from. Shang-Chi received his acceptance letter to the art school in Beijing in 1984, 6 years into the reform and opening up of China under Deng Xiaoping. In the year zero of that experiment, 1978, Shang-Chi's family had still been writing down every cent they spent into a small lined book each day, exerting painstaking control against the fear of running out of money before the end of the month. Despite their tight budget, they had in fact been relatively secure, with both parents in professional city jobs. Out in the countryside, things had been much tougher in those years. Anhui had traditionally been one of the food baskets of China, but in the late 1970s, it was mired in poverty. Decades of communal farming, disastrous irrigation projects, and the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward had devastated rural life. The scars of the Great Leap ran particularly deep there. Around China, between 36 and 45 million people died between 1958 and 1962. Sacrificed to Mao's fantasy of a great leap forward in agricultural and industrial production, symbolized by his demand that China overtake Britain in steel output within just 15 years. Agricultural production broke down under the pressure of forced collectivization and the diversion of farmers to steel production. The result was not a great leap forward, but a great famine, the greatest tragedy the country had ever suffered. In one district, Fuyang, to the northwest of Hefei, some 2.4 million people died out of a population of 8 million in 3 years from 1958. Throughout Anhui province, many more died of starvation or disease, and in the violence that welled up amid the chaos. At the end of those years, the trees stood like skeletons, their leaves and bark stripped for food by people who, at the end, would eat the earth itself to staunch their hunger. Perhaps it's no surprise, then, that it was in the desperately poor Anhui that a group of farmers first took the risk of throwing off the communal system and taking individual responsibility again for the land. In December 1978, in a small village called Xiaogang to the east of Hefei, 18 farmers gathered one night to sign a secret pact. After years of pitiful harvests that had turned the villagers into beggars, they had decided to divide their communal land into family farms again. They would farm their plots separately, and although each farmer would still reserve a set amount of grain for the collective and the state, anything above that they would keep for themselves. The land would remain in state ownership as it still does today, but the farmers would once again guide its destiny. One by one, each dipped his index finger into the red ink and made a mark beside his name. They vowed that if any of them was to be arrested and punished, the others would take care of their family. The document still exists, preserved today in the National Museum in Beijing, the red fingerprints like bloodstains on a fragile paper. By the next harvest, the village output had soared, and their secret was out. It had been a desperate gamble to stare down the party's ideologues, but the farmers were on the right side of history. In Beijing, Deng Xiaoping had secured his grip on the power the same month the Xiaogang farmers made their secret pact, and his pragmatic leadership favored the loosening of government controls to drive enterprise and productivity. By the time Shang-Chi ripped open the envelope to his acceptance letter from Beijing in the summer of 1984, almost 100% of China's farmers had followed the lead of the villagers of Xiaogang and taken control of the land again. The breakup of the communes would lead not just to bigger harvests and the fading of the specter of hunger, but also to experimentation with new crops and side enterprises in manufacturing and services, driving an extraordinary transformation in the lives of 80% of China's population that then lived in the countryside. In the 1980s, more than 150 million people in China would be lifted out of poverty, a phase which fails to convey the real truth, that the farmers lifted themselves out of poverty through the passion with which they pursued new opportunities and their creativity in finding new ways to exploit their resources. It was a revolution that would change the whole of China beyond recognition. It would transform the countryside and the cities, as surplus farmers left the fields to seek their fortune far from their rural homes. They would go not just to feed the exploding demand for labor, as China transformed itself into a major manufacturing and trading power, but also to start their own businesses. By the time Shang-Chi took his own journey to the capital, the urbanization of China was well underway. At the end of the summer of 1984, Shenji took the 9-hour journey in a hard-seat carriage to take up his place at college in Beijing. Hard seat is what the Chinese call third class, and you need to be lucky and fast on your feet to get a seat at all. It's an uncomfortable but convivial way to travel. On the journey, Shenji met a friendly young soldier, happy to share his knowledge of the world with the star-struck aspiring artist. Shenji had nurtured a kind of hero worship for soldiers since he was a child, and was excited to find himself talking to one. He asked his companion to tell him about Beijing. The soldier laughed and asked Shenji to imagine China as a bald man's head on which one single hair grows. "Beijing," he told Shenji, "is that hair." Disembarking at the teeming Beijing Central Station, Shenji saw a series of tables dotted around the concourse. Each of the capital's universities and colleges had established outposts at the station to greet the new students arriving from around China. After registering, he was given the number of the bus that would take him to his school. His adventure had begun. He couldn't know it then, but it was an adventure that in a few short years would lead to disillusionment, horror, and a moment of excruciating despair that would change his life forever. Thousands of young people like Shenji were treading the same path, and 1984 was the year when everything started to change faster than had ever seemed imaginable. To understand what it felt like to live through the 1980s in China, it helps to think about the 1960s in the West. The decade followed a similar trajectory. A slow start followed by rollicking middle years of white-hot excitement when anything seemed possible. Dreams could be big in the 1980s in China, and idealism was sky-high. The 80s saw the birth of rock and roll in China and the beginning of a sexual revolution. But just like the 1960s in the West, the 1980s ended in violence and bloodshed for China. As France had the events of May 1968, and the United States had Kent State, China was to draw down the curtain on the decade with one of the darkest episodes in its history. Early that same year in the far western province of Xinjiang, in a city further from the sea than any on earth, a young man slipped away from the noise of the carpet factory where he worked into the quiet warmth of a wool-dyeing room. Here, where the heavy woolen skeins seemed to absorb every sound, he made a nest to study for his exams. It was so peaceful there that sometimes he felt he could hear the blood running in his veins. Inside this cocoon, he dreamed of far-off Beijing, where he hoped he would become an artist. His name was Anwar. He had been born in the oasis town of Kharjilik on the southern fringe of the Taklamakan Desert at the heart of Xinjiang. Kharjilik had once been an important way station on the southern Silk Road, where traders would gather before tackling the mountain passes to India. In the 1980s, the old culture still persisted in the town of richly colored carpets and watery ikat silks made by hand, jewel-like tiles and intricate adobe brickwork, shady pergolas heavy with grapevines in summer, and pomegranates, apricot and quinces picked from trees watered by snowmelt from the Karakoram. The sky stretches vast above your head in Xinjiang. Whether you are in the baked ochred oases of the south or in the rich pastures of the north where nomadic herdsmen still range, 1/6 of China's territories today is contained in the western province, an area 3 times the size of France. Buried in its shifting sands are mummies, lost cities, and other remains of people who have long since disappeared from history, whose very origins are unknown. These lands came late to China, annexed by the Emperor Qianlong in the 1750s. The name that was later chosen for them, Xinjiang, New Territories, proclaimed their separateness with a nation that had hitherto been relatively homogeneous. With the taking of Xinjiang, China drew the other inside its borders. The nation became multicultural and, from that moment on, more difficult to control. For millennia before the 18th century, the people of Xinjiang had dealt with China as traders, adversaries, and sometimes subjects. They had long supplied China with its treasured jade, while their position at the heart of Central Asia delivered them guardianship of China's roads to and from the west. Just as silk made its way westward through Xinjiang's oases, Buddhism made staging posts in those same oases on the way from India into China. Objects as classically Chinese as Ming Dynasty, 1368 through 1644, blue and white porcelain only became possible when cobalt blue glazes made their way from Persia to China through the oases of Xinjiang. Turk people first came to Xinjiang in the mid-16th century when Kuk Turks rode out from Mongolia to establish sway over a territory that stretched as far as Afghanistan and northern India and into what are now the lands of Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. They mixed with the Indo-Europeans who had come before them and began to forge the distinctive culture that still animates the region today. In Xinjiang, the predominant ethnic group are the Uyghur people, but they share the province with the Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Tajiks, whose ethnic brothers have established independent states along China's borders. The Uyghur mother tongue is Turkic and closely similar to many of the languages of Central Asia, so Xinjiang's cultural and linguistic ties are closer to its western neighbors than to China. Overlaying the Turkic culture is Islam, which arrived in Xinjiang in the 10th century, carrying with it another set of traditions and loyalties that deepen Xinjiang's cultural distinctiveness from China. By the time Anwar was born, Xinjiang was no longer a crossroads. The mountain passes to the west were closed, and Xinjiang no longer traded with the outside world. All roads instead led to Beijing and, from 1949, although its provincial capital was some 3,700 kilometers away, Xinjiang ran on Beijing time. Now reading for hours in the quiet of the wool dyeing room, Anwar was securing his passage to Beijing. In the same month that Shenqi took the train from Anhui to the capital, Anwar would be boarding one too. Even as the summer of 1984 would find young people like Shenqi and Anwar arriving in Beijing high with excitement, it would see Huang Rui leave. The early years of the 1980s were tough for Huang Rui and his fellow stars. The initial triumph at being able to stage their exhibition had given way to a series of reversals, and, finally, a real fear about what kind of future they could make for themselves in China. At first, things had gone well. The stars had garnered support among many of the older artists and had been accepted into the official Artists Association. In the autumn of 1980, Huang Rui and Ma Deshang had set off on a lecture tour around China, visiting 30 cities and talking to art students and teachers about the stars' exhibition and their vision for art. At one college, the Sichuan Fine Arts Institute in Chongqing, more than 800 students came to hear them speak. Back in Beijing in the spring of 1981, visiting celebrities such as the composer Jean-Michel Jarre and his actress wife Charlotte Rampling sought out the stars and discussed collaborations with Huang Rui. The stars and their friends held parties in the ruins of the old summer palace, where young Chinese and Westerners danced together among the fallen stones. There was an excitement both inside and outside China about where reform might lead. But not everyone was excited. Conservative Party ideologues like the propaganda chief Deng Liqing saw danger in the spread of notions like individualism and humanism into Chinese intellectual life. He saw them as the antithetical to the acceptance of party control. Criticism of artists, writers, and intellectuals with bourgeois ideas began to ratchet up. Today had been banned at the end of 1980, while Huang Rui and Ma Deshang were still on the road, and, as 1981 wore on, the stars found their newly won membership of the Artists Association canceled and their landmark exhibition criticized. They could feel themselves being forced underground again, as they were denied a public space in which to work and exhibit. As the economy opened up in the early 1980s, corruption and crime flourished. It was easy for conservatives to link this to the pollution of bourgeois thought. In August 1983, a nationwide crackdown on crime was launched, followed a few months later by the official campaign against spiritual pollution. Law enforcement around the country was encouraged to strike hard against hooliganism. Within a few months, tens of thousands of young people had been sentenced to reform through labor in far-off prison camps, and thousands more had been executed for ill-defined crimes. Propaganda suggested a slippery slope from Western hairstyles, clothing, and dancing to pornography, theft, and violent crime. Huang Rui and his fellow stars felt their world closing in again. In August 1983, an exhibition by Huang Rui, Ma Deshang, and Wang Keping was shut down after just a few days, and the police took to dropping in on them at home. Meanwhile, the poetry of their friends, Beidao and Manke, was denounced as misty, incomprehensible, and enslaved to Western ideas. The term misty poets, intended as a criticism, quickly became a badge of honor. The anti-spiritual pollution campaign only lasted 3 months, its hysterical tone causing so much negative publicity outside China and fear within that Deng Xiaoping was convinced to call it off. But the damage was done. Huang Rui was exhausted. He had seen the wheel turn once too often. Hope and excitement in China seemed inevitably to be followed by repression and disappointment. He needed to escape the cycle. In the autumn of 1982, he met a young Japanese woman, Fujiko Tomi, who had come from Osaka to study in Beijing. Less than a year later, they married. "I had never thought of getting married before," he told me years later, "but I realized I needed to get out of the country." By early 1984, both he and Wang Keping had decided to leave China. Wang Keping had also married his foreign girlfriend, a young teacher from France. The two friends would head for foreign cities at opposite ends of the world. The night they told Ma Zheshang, he wept. A year later, he too would choose exile abroad. Huang Rui boarded the plane for Osaka at the height of summer 1984, with no idea that within months the wheel would turn again and set off what would be the most exhilarating period in Chinese contemporary history. It would last barely 5 years, but it would shake the country to its core. Before it ended, Huang Rui would find himself back again in Tiananmen Square. In 1984, an aspiring artist called Gongkar Gyatso was also leaving Beijing, but he was heading back to his hometown of Lhasa after 4 years as a student in the capital. His time in Beijing had been a revelation, and he was determined to create an artistic life for himself in the city of his birth. When he had first come to Beijing in 1980, he had, as he told me, been very red, one of the Communist Party's true believers. His father was an army man, born in the town of Amdo in Qinghai Province on the Tibetan Plateau. He had arrived in Lhasa with the People's Liberation Army, PLA, in 1954 when the Dalai Lama still lived in the city. Gongkar's mother was a passionate communist. Before the PLA entered Tibet in 1950, she had lived in a kind of servitude that she considered akin to slavery. Under Chinese administration, she had been given the opportunity to study, and her gratitude ran deep. His father's military connections ensured that Gongkar and his sister would see out the turbulent 60s and early 70s in relative security. In 1979, at the age of 18, he had secured a steady job working as a museum guide in Lhasa, and it was there that his enthusiasm and lively intellect caught the attention of some visiting artists from Beijing. They encouraged him to sit the exams for art school, and he was accepted in the summer of 1980. It wasn't long after he started college in Beijing that he realized that the real excitement was outside the school gates, not in the classroom where he was studying Chinese traditional painting. There was plenty of art to see, and he was fascinated by the exhibitions of Western art that were beginning to arrive in China. But it was the books that captured his imagination. In those years, Chinese translations of Western books were coming thick and fast. He loved reading about Western art, but it was Western philosophy that really spoke to him. Sartre and Nietzsche impressed him, but it was Schopenhauer who inspired him. Even after finishing university, I kept reading him. His theories really chimed with me, his sense of man's loneliness and struggle. He awakened the desire in me to search for something spiritual. When he had first arrived in the capital, he had felt secure in his identity. Before I went to Beijing, I had no concept of myself being Tibetan and other people being Chinese. I was very ideological, a real communist. But soon I began to feel a real clash in my heart and in my head. I suddenly realized I'm Tibetan, I'm not Chinese, and the philosophy books really helped me consider these questions and to connect with spirituality, which I'd never been exposed to before. He had grown up in a period when religious expression was heavily repressed, and he had never seen a Buddhist shrine. But in the early 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, the practice of religion was no longer deemed a crime, and religious tolerance was enshrined in the Chinese constitution. In 1983, on a visit to Lhasa, he came upon his grandmother worshipping quietly at a small shrine in her home. Gongkar was 22, and he experienced for the first time the heady smell of incense and the sight of the curls of perfumed smoke rising before a statue of the Buddha. By the time he graduated in 1984, he was anxious to get home again. The time in Beijing had been exhilarating but also painful. During these years, his whole sense of himself had been overturned. Now he was ready to get out of the classroom and discover what it really meant to be Tibetan. He hoped that back in Lhasa, he'd be able to find out. Guo Jian hesitated at the door of a darkened studio. It was early autumn 1985. He had been in Beijing for a few weeks now, but he still hadn't found what he was looking for. Maybe he would find it tonight. He still couldn't quite believe he was here, in Beijing, 2,000 kilometers from his hometown in Guizhou. He had left the army in 1982 after 3 years in uniform, but little seemed to have changed when he got home. His girlfriend was still refusing to marry him. She couldn't understand why he had no ambition to join the Communist Party and was pressing him to go to university. To Guo Jian, it seemed impossible. He had hardly been to school, and although the universities were, in theory now, open to all on merit, he couldn't imagine how he would ever pass the exams. All he could do, he thought, was continue to draw and paint, and trust that his talent might lead him somewhere. It was a stroke of luck that took him to Beijing. In early 1985, he was walking with his sketchbook when he ran into one of his old teachers. She was talking to a woman who turned out to be a visiting art professor from Beijing, who took one look at his sketches and asked to see more. As it happened, she was a scout from Minzu University, a college in the capital aimed exclusively at China's dozens of ethnic minorities. Guo Jian was one of them. His ancestry was Buyi, an ethnically distinct group scattered across 3 provinces of southern China. At Minzu University, the woman explained, there was a handful of places for students wanting to study art. It was for one of these places, as it happened, that Gongor had been chosen 5 years before. Later that year, Guo Jian found himself in a crowded room in the provincial capital, Guiyang, one of 100 applicants competing for a single space at Minzu University. After 2 days, they had winnowed the competitors down to 20, and on the 3rd day, they were set a test. They were each to create a composition inspired by one of the 4 seasons. All around him, his rivals started turning out scarily polished compositions of snowy winter mountains and autumn harvests. Guo Jian chose spring, but instead of birds and flower, he drew an old man coming home from the market just before Chinese New Year, lugging a mirror. On this, the man would write, as an old tradition dictated, his wishes for the new year. Wizened with age and smoking his pipe, it was this old man and his air of unquenchable optimism that got Guo Jian into the university in Beijing. He had traveled for 2 nights and 3 days to reach the capital. As his train crossed the Yangtze River, Guo Jian saw for the first time the open plains of China's north. The mountains of Guizhou always seemed to him to block the view. You could look and look, he told me, but never see beyond them. Now he could see for miles, and he liked it. Arriving at university, he found himself on a campus filled with people from parts of China he had hardly known existed. In his dorm room alone, there were students from Xinjiang, from Inner Mongolia, and a tiny county called Mohe, which was as far north as you could go and still be in China, where winter lasted half the year and the northern lights played across the sky. In his first weeks, he'd gone to some parties, but they were all rather staid. Somehow he hadn't yet found the door into the world he had dreamt was out there ever since he first heard Deng Lijun sing. And then he had got the invitation that led him to his door. Easing it open, it seemed at first that the room was totally dark. There was music playing, and in the distance, a small red light was glowing. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw people dancing, smoking, lying on the floor. This was alarming. Just a year ago, he had been painting propaganda posters for the anti-spiritual pollution campaign. Even in remote Guizhou, the campaign had seen scores of young people imprisoned and some even executed for activities just like those going on in this room. Guo Jian backed away, but someone pulled him back. "Don't worry," they said. "We're all artists here." If this was meant to reassure him, it wasn't working. Then a group of girls dragged him toward the dance floor. He was older, he thought. He was meant to be a class leader, and his teachers expected him to be serious. But the girls seemed to know he wasn't that kind of guy. He knew it, too. He wasn't that kind of guy. It was the first night he ever heard Western music, and the first time he danced to it, the first time he drank ergoto, and it was the first time he tasted red wine, which they shared out of a single cup while they rolled cigarettes and scraps of newspaper. Even today, the sound of Western music brings back to him the taste of printer's ink, tobacco and red wine, the sorghum reek of ergoto, and the scent of a single brand of shampoo that all the girls used in those days. Later, Guo Jian couldn't remember exactly what music he heard that night, but every song was new. In those years, the West came to China on cassette tapes, mixed by foreigners before they left home and copied for their new Chinese friends. Homesickness weighted these collections toward the iconic, to the anthems and the classics, and so the soundscape of mid-'80s China, sounds of silence mixed with Hotel California, life during wartime with Brown Sugar, and Beat It with like a Rolling Stone and Je t'aime, moi non plus. The history of Western rock and pop became the soundtrack for Beijing's summer of love, romantic, elusive, sexy, poetic, and subversive. Even today, drunken reunions in China can erupt late in the evening into slurred renditions of John Denver's Take Me Home Country Roads, while Sounds of Silence plays on a continuous loop for ice skaters on the Forbidden City's frozen moat. That night, Guozhen stepped inside the underground culture that would be his true university for the next 4 years. From then on, he committed to a helter-skelter journey of discovery, ignoring the course laid down for him by his elders, following connections where they led, looking for new worlds in art and literature and life. And around the country, hundreds of thousands of other young people would do the same. The host of the party that night was Anwar. He had arrived in Beijing just a year before Guozhen and found that Minzu University was a perfect base for exploration. It was an academy of outsiders, their ethnic origins marking them out from the Han Chinese majority. The neighboring big institutions like Peking University and Renmin People's University might have been the intellectual vanguard, but Minzu was edgier. By the time Guozhen met him, Anwar already had a reputation as the king of cool. "I think he was born cool," Guozhen reminisced to me one day. "He was just so avant-garde, so far ahead with the music he was listening to and the way he dressed, and he was making connections with foreigners way before the rest of us." On the weekends, Anwar and his friends would organize parties in their class studio on campus. They would spread the word to people they thought would be interesting, even stopping individuals they liked the look of on the street. It was natural that they would ask Guozhen, this young guy from the South who still wore his army uniform. And every weekend there was a standing invitation to the young women who modeled for their life classes. These women were pioneers. Nude modeling had been banned during the Cultural Revolution, and it was only in 1984 that life classes were once again allowed in art schools. In that first year, there were just 3 young women in Beijing who took up the challenge. It was still the era when people worked in assigned jobs. Theirs was in a state factory, but it was the kind of place that Deng Xiaoping's reforms would soon put out of business. The girls pulled wages of around 40 yuan a month simply to clock on and read the papers. For art school modeling, they could get 8 yuan an hour and an entry to the avant-garde. It was no contest. They modeled for each of the colleges in Beijing and were couriers for the gossip of the burgeoning Beijing art world. They took on the role of model and muse for Anwar and his classmates, keeping them in cigarettes, buying them canvas if they couldn't afford it, and mothering them with advice. Paid by the hour, they arrived early and left late. They would doze on the sofa they posed on and fix their hair in the beautiful antique mirror that was rumored to have come from the Forbidden City. The spacious campus of Minzu University had run a little wild during the Cultural Revolution, and abandoned buildings were scattered at the corners of its ruined grounds. Anwar and 2 of his friends decided to take one over for a project. Their idea was to create a world apart into which other people could enter. All 3 were painters, but they had no interest in staging a formal exhibition. Instead, they wanted to create a space for the imagination, a 3-dimensional artwork using sound, light, color, and scent. They didn't have the vocabulary to describe what they were doing or the background in Western art to know, but they were arranging one of China's first art installations. Wisely or not, they went ahead without official permission. The building they chose was perfect, cavernous, empty, and a long way from the teachers' classrooms. They carpeted the concrete floor with fallen leaves and lit the corners of the room with candles. They hung their paintings high on the walls at odd angles. Feeling something was still missing, Anwar selected a dead tree branch and placed it high in the rafters and brushed onto its gnarled surface a single line of pigment. When they were ready, they spread the word as they had for their parties, inviting their friends and roping in strangers from the street. The opening was a sensation. They had created a soundscape with an ethnic Korean drummer, a Tibetan singer, and a lutenist from Xinjiang. It was like no music that anyone had ever heard. The space teemed with people, and a woodland scent rose from the crushed leaves, while shadows went leaping up the walls as the candles flared and guttered. People stayed for hours, captivated by the music and the warm light, the oddly hung paintings, and the forest ambiance. When the last visitor left, The artists bedded down on the floor among the leaves. Fine Arts in China, a critical magazine that was itself only a few months old, was enthusiastic. The university authorities weren't. "You're not here to make art," the three were told. "You're here to learn." Under orders to close the space, the students sought out the biggest padlock they could find, so that if people leaned hard on the door, they could still look through the gap into the space within, where the forbidden world lived on. Early in 1986, Fine Arts invited Anwar to publish his statement on the project. He wrote, "We do not want to follow any school of thought or painting. We simply hope that our successes or our failures will be of our own making." It was the spirit that drove a lot of things in those years. All over China, people were trying to make their own decisions and find their own way, not just in the universities, but on the farms, and among the burgeoning group of independent traders who were beginning to change the face of the cities. People wanted to be themselves. More dangerously, many of them wanted to be heard. Guo Jian stood in the crowd pressing up against the stage, waiting for the concert to start. He'd taken a risk to be here. At the door, a stony-faced clerk had registered his name and checked his detail against his identity card, while a stream of foreigners flowed past him into the hall, unchallenged. Direct contact between ordinary Chinese and foreigners was discouraged, and making Chinese register was a form of silent intimidation. Guo Jian had spent long enough in the army administration to know things like this always ended up on your file, but he no longer cared enough to be cautious. Ever since the night of the party, he had been chasing connections. He was always sneaking off from school to see new exhibitions before they were closed down. He had been to Anwar's show and was amazed. He couldn't understand where all these ideas were coming from. He stopped painting and started reading. Suddenly, it seemed like every book in the world was available. He'd pick them up one after another in the markets or from a guy selling off a pedal cart by the side of the road. Lucian, Nietzsche, Sartre, Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. New books would come so rapidly that he had never seemed to finish one before another demanded his attention. The whole of Western modernism was coming at China in a rush. Revolutions in thought long assimilated into the Western canon broke over them in waves. The whole of 20th century art was telescoped, too. Cubism, Expressionism, Warhol, and Dali were jumbled into whatever patterns Guo Jian and thousands like him felt like making. Just like the mixtapes of Western music, Western culture arrived in China in a glorious mashup that gave it a new vitality. Among his teachers, Guo Jian found one true iconoclast. Still in his 20s, the teacher guided him to art he might never have found on his own, like the tortured erotic works of Egon Schiele. He gave him his first real education in Western music as well, spinning cassettes for him and tracing the influences of Prince, the Police, the Eagles, and the Beatles. All over Beijing, young Chinese musicians had started putting their own rock acts together. It was only a matter of time before one of them broke out. But no one was prepared for the impact of Cui Jian when he arrived. He had written a hit that was being sung from one end of the country to the other, and now Gui Zhang was standing in the surging crowd, waiting for him to take the stage. In the early 80s, Cui Jian had been a classically trained 20-something trumpeter with the Beijing Philharmonic Orchestra when a friend sat him down with some mixtapes of American rock. Cui Jian went straight out to buy his first guitar, and by the mid-80s, he and his new band were playing the capital's sketchy bar scene. Then in May 1986, at the age of 24, he took the stage at a nationally televised concert for peace at the Beijing's Workers' Stadium. Dressed in traditional high-collared tunic like a Qing Dynasty guitar hero, he played Nothing to My Name for the first time. Chinese rock and roll was never the same after that. It was Nothing to My Name that Guo Jian and everyone else had come to hear that night, and when the first shimmering chords floated through the hall, the crowd went wild. The song's plaintive start is a lover's plea to a woman who spurns him. Through the first two verses he offers her his dreams and his freedom, but she just laughs at him because, in the words of the famous chorus, he has nothing to his name. Suddenly, a fiery instrumental duel breaks out between guitar and Chinese trumpet, and hope fills the final verse as the singer sees his lover's hands begin to tremble and her eyes fill with tears. The song ends with a soaring realization that she will go with him after all. Nothing to My Name was written as a love song, but its theme of alienation, its triumphant progression, and, Cui Jiang's Springsteen-like delivery turned it into something that spoke to Chinese youth about a lot more than a boy and a girl. Like all the great rock and roll anthems, it had a simple lyric that caught the mood of the moment. Just singing the chorus was a release for young people who were starting to wonder if the world they were living in could ever measure up to the one they dreamed of. Guojian told me years later that Nothing to My Name was the first song he ever heard that really seemed to be in a Chinese voice,